The president of the Swiss National Bank strictly rejects a strategic Bitcoin reserve and has lost control over his life here. In a new interview, he puts forward some strong anti-Bitcoin theses. He says Bitcoin is too volatile, it has no value, and you can't build a reserve with it. With Bitcoin. Meanwhile, the Swiss franc is losing purchasing power every day. Additionally, the Swiss National Bank has an overexposure to euro government bonds. This will also be addressed later in an interview here. So he was a guest in an interview here, and things are really heating up. What he's saying here, because in the end, that's the big game. That's currently happening. Countries like the USA are opening up to Bitcoin, while on the other side, here's the president of the National Bank here in Switzerland, who is shutting himself off. Europe is closing itself off and much more. But there is now a Bitcoin initiative in Switzerland that wants to try it now, to proactively push Bitcoin forward. And that's also what a TV report is about. On one side, we have the National Bank or the president who wants to reject all of this, let's say. On the other side, there are the citizens, the people who would really like to have a Bitcoin reserve or at least keep Bitcoin in balance. And now we're going to take a look at this nearly 3-minute TV segment, because this is as explosive as it gets. We keep seeing the same arguments over and over. So it's not like there are any new arguments coming up here. And the funny thing is, he's been asked about Bitcoin more and more often here, and the same answers keep coming up here. And it doesn't seem like you're making any progress here or learning anything. The same ridiculous arguments keep coming up that have already been brought up 5 years ago, even 10 years ago. And it's an endless loop here. And I mean, Switzerland would obviously be a perfect fit for Bitcoin. Switzerland is organized, decentralized like many countries. Swiss bank strategy excels. In their overall, let's say, central bank strategy, they're already doing very, very well. They buy quite a bit. Very good assets, holders of many top stocks worldwide. Bitcoin clip. You haven't quite grasped the step to Bitcoin yet. But hey, check out the clip. Here, ultra explosive on Swiss TV, from the president of the National Bank and much more.
The Swiss National Bank manages large amounts. 795 billion francs were the total by 2023, or 88,000 per Swiss person, 7% invested in gold. But the biggest part is foreign currency investments. So, investments in foreign currencies, mainly US dollars and euros. Of that, 64% are in government bonds and 25% in stocks.
So far, they have this investment. There are people who say that actually the national bank should, in America, Donald Trump has already called for this, hold certain reserves in Bitcoin. What do you think about that? Because they were on this show last time. Do you find Bitcoin an interesting concept? Has it become more interesting by now?
Bitcoin is still an interesting concept. Better said, the distributed ledger technology is an interesting concept. But when it comes to currency reserves, it's important to understand. Central bank holds currency reserves at all. That's to support monetary policy. So that can happen. They need to be valuable. They need to ensure the real value is maintained over time. That's exactly not the case with cryptocurrencies. They have very strong fluctuations. They could be worth that much today.
With 5 billion, let's say, how much Bitcoin would you have held last year? Would you have had a profit of 100 billion instead of 80 billion?
Many cryptocurrencies are speculative and mainly increase in value.
They don't want any Bitcoin. Now there's a group in Switzerland that actually wants to force a person to invest in Bitcoins at all. This group wants to start an initiative who have actually guided Bitcoin from the Swiss National Bank. One of the members of this initiative is Lucius Meiser from the board of Bitcoin Suisse. What does this initiative actually want?
We want to add 3 words to the Constitution. Article 99 sets out the mandate for the National Bank. There we want to say that it should invest in gold and Bitcoin. The purpose is to strengthen the independence of the National Bank. Bitcoin is suitable as a non-state currency to strengthen independence.
Now, cryptocurrencies are something very volatile, also associated with a lot of risk. Why should the SNB take that risk?
In the end, it's dose that makes poison. Be cautious with investments. Overweight in euro bonds is risky. That means if you have a lot of overweight in euro bonds, that's also a big risk. If in a future euro crisis the euro loses 10, 20, or 50% of its value, then we have a really big problem. If you shift part of that into Bitcoin, it could help ease the problem, and would only have one very big problem left. A frightening scenario.
So he says to balance things out. Basically, it's about increasing the independence of the national bank. Bitcoin, the head of the national bank on this topic.
Right now, signatures are being collected for this initiative, and I can't comment on that anymore.
But they wouldn't say that this would promote their stability now. Philip.
I mentioned earlier that cryptocurrencies in general typically have very high value fluctuations. And that makes it just not very suitable as a currency reserve right now.
Not very suitable, so good.
So I really don't get that. It really says here the currency reserve is not suitable. Of course, this is from the Bitcoin initiative. Super bullish, forcing the central bank, buying Bitcoin. But what the president is saying just doesn't make any sense. Because what it ultimately says here is, okay, Bitcoin is too volatile, way too many fluctuations. But I've said that before. The currency reserve isn't meant for that. That you have the currency reserve now and then somehow sell it again in 2 weeks. That means the volatility with Bitcoin, if you've really looked into it. If you subscribe to our channel here, go ahead and hit the subscribe bell down below too. We really need to gain some traction here. Then you definitely have to take that into account here. That Bitcoin, of course, it's volatile in the short term, but it keeps going up in the long term. And that's basically the whole point. If you have an asset here that gains purchasing power in the long run, that it goes up in price, but just in the short term. If it has volatility, then it's really not a problem. Because a currency reserve, it holds up well for 10 years, for 20 years, for 30 years. And over a 30-year period, over a 10-year period, even for me, over a 4 or 5-year period, the volatility here is really not a problem. And that's why it's just a bullshit argument. Here, it's basically the fiat elite that's shaking in their boots and has ultimately missed the boat. I don't know if it's intentional or not. Whether they're just ignoring Bitcoin or if it's just ignorance. If it's stupidity, whatever. But I can't imagine that central banks have never talked about Bitcoin. That they somehow have no information about it at all. I mean, the way he's talking here, that doesn't sound like he really gets it here. Or something like that. And that's basically the scary part, that a huge wealth redistribution is happening here. And the central banks, the people, the states, the nations that understand all of this, those who jump on the bandwagon will benefit massively. And the central banks, the states, and so on that don't get it, they're really going to fall way behind, I'd say. And the crazy thing is, what he brings up here is that he says, coin has no value. But that makes me wonder, if Bitcoin has no value, why is the price at 100,000? Volatile value is subjective. We have to separate price and value. There's a price, which is basically determined by supply and demand. Definitely, and the value is just, let's say, determined subjectively. And when someone here says, for example, that Bitcoin is worthless, then he usually doesn't see any benefit in Bitcoin either. That means he doesn't see the properties of Bitcoin, like the fact that it's a state-independent currency. That's also what the speaker from the Bitcoin initiative basically pitched later on. He said, hey, Bitcoin is a state-independent currency, just like gold. And as a national bank, we definitely don't want to become dependent on Europe. We don't want to become dependent from the USA. And what is Switzerland doing? It's dependent on the euro from Europe. It is dependent on the USA. We saw it. Wait, I wrote it down. 64% in states. And a big part of that is in euros and dollars. So what's happening here? What if the euro devalues? And that's already happening right now. Then the Swiss reserves will also massively devalue. The speaker here from the Bitcoin initiative in Switzerland even gave a talk in Switzerland. He calculated it out. How many billions has Switzerland missed out on here? Because instead of buying Bitcoin here, they bet on euro government bonds. And so they basically missed out on massive profits. I don't remember exactly how much that was, but it was definitely several billion here. What happens if the euro completely crashes? What if there's hyperinflation? What if the dollar completely crashes? I mean, that's not so unlikely. France, they're really struggling. There are a few other candidates in Europe that, let's just say, don't look so good. And in Europe, the countries leave, it fails, high risk. And if 2 or 3 countries drop out, then the whole thing just crashes. So it's definitely a very high risk that you have here that will also be presented here later by the initiative. When people say Bitcoin is too high of a risk, but on the other hand, you've got more than 20 or 30% in US government bonds from a country or something like the US or Europe or the EU, then those statements are really critical. And then it will also be added here, complemented by the speech of the initiative from Switzerland. That's the dose. That's what makes the poison. They have 7% in gold. You can take less in Bitcoin. Start with 1%. I mean, if you really say, let's allocate this right, then you should at least take as much Bitcoin as gold. But I say you can start with just 1%, like just 1%. They really haven't messed things up too much here. And with 1%, the volatility isn't really a problem at all. It actually helps balance the portfolio better. because with Bitcoin, we have an uncorrelated asset. That means, for example, when bonds go up, Bitcoin might go down, and when Bitcoin goes up, bonds might go down. So you have a certain balance here, which allows you to diversify the portfolio even more. And what you really need to understand here is, as a central bank, as a nation, as a state, as an individual, this is really the moment where it's more dangerous and riskier. Not holding Bitcoin is riskier than holding Bitcoin. So anyone who doesn't have Bitcoin right now is at a higher risk. Like someone who has Bitcoin, because you can at least see it as insurance, for example. So let's say something really happens globally and there's actually a pullback here. If the dollar collapses, then the euro will get dragged down too. Very, very likely. We have like one. In a global crisis scenario, then the states really don't bring anything to the table. Neither the dollar government bonds nor the euro government bonds. But then gold comes back into play here. Then you have the historically very, very good store of value gold. But now you would also have the really great decentralized store of value Bitcoin. And you would basically be able to act. You could still make payments. Even if, for example, the dollar system completely goes down the drain. It doesn't have to be long, but it could happen. For example, during periods of 2 or 3 weeks, there can really be turmoil. It goes completely off the rails, like in the 1920s or something, the Weimar hyperinflation or whatever. It doesn't have to come to that, of course. But as a central bank, you really need to hedge against such risks. That means the likelihood of something like that happening is very, very low. But with Bitcoin, you would have a safeguard and you could allocate 1%. Then at least you would still be able to act. Could start here in a decentralized way. Independently swap transactions back and forth. So I really don't see the problem with at least trying it out. Or at least that you evaluate it. Just like in the USA where you say, okay, we're setting up a group here, and with that group, we can evaluate this. And then we'll see, okay, how does it look? Are we doing this or not? But hey, guys, let me know in the comments what you think. I also have an important message for you that I want to share. But before that, it's also important for you to understand this. You now have the opportunity to front-run the Swiss National Bank, the central bank here in Switzerland. They don't get it. But you get it. And at some point, the national bank will be forced to buy Bitcoin. At the latest, when the USA really takes that step and goes all in on Bitcoin and builds up a stockpile or something like that. But you can now front-run the national banks, the central banks, and all the governments here. Okay, that pitch was really rough, but I've got a link down below where you can buy Bitcoin to front-run the states. And now I have a massive message for you all that should really make it clear. Why should a central bank be here? As a Bitcoiner, as an individual, as a family, no matter who you are, you definitely shouldn't sleep on Bitcoin right now.
Guys, we are here at the absolute coolest spot in all of El Salvador. Check this out. We're here at the hot springs in El Salvador. It's all here warm water. That means when I go in here, the water is somehow just over 40 degrees or so. When I get to 50 degrees, it's basically like a giant bathtub here. It goes further back. And that's the crazy thing, that with Bitcoin, it's just like here, at the waterfalls. Bitcoin is a force of nature that you just can't stop. Just like if you try to stop the waterfall, if I stand there and say, hey, stop flowing now, that's just not gonna work, because it's just a brutal force of nature and you can't just stop a waterfall like that. A lot of people have tried to stop Bitcoin. No one has succeeded, and that's why Bitcoin will keep flowing, just like this waterfall. And you have to keep reminding yourself of that Bitcoin can't be stopped. This waterfall is also very hard to stop. Bitcoin is even harder to stop than this waterfall. Guys, let me show you this awesome view again and send you many greetings from El Salvador, sending you lots of sunshine. And I'm gonna take a dip here. We'll take a look. If you can jump in here, there's definitely a big jump here. I gotta check it out. Does that even work? Maybe I'll make another video with a jump. And if you want to buy Bitcoin, I'll drop a link for you down below. 21 Bitcoin, how you can easily and safely buy Bitcoin. Here at the Put Bitcoin Hotel, you can still get up to 20% off fees when buying Bitcoin. See you later. Peace out.